I think that Fragile X is a very attractive proposition for pharma companies for any number of reasons. Most importantly, it's a rare disease, it's an orphan indication, so you still have the benefits that come from having that orphan drug designation. It's a little bit easier to develop your drug. You basically get some credit with the FDA when you're working on an orphan indication. It's just easier all around because you don't have to have enormous, large-scale clinical trials. If you're developing a drug for Alzheimer's disease, you need to have thousands and thousands of patients in your clinical trials, and that's incredibly expensive. If you're developing a drug for Fragile X, you need to have 150 patients in your pivotal clinical trials. So it's relatively easy to do, and we've got the subjects, we've got the patients, we've got the volunteers, we've got research subjects available. So it's at this point a bit of a well-worn path compared to a lot of other rare diseases. You have to keep in mind that a lot of rare diseases are incredibly rare, and I consult with a number of foundations that are working on rare diseases that have 50 or 100 people in the entire United States. And how do you even begin to think about doing clinical trials with a condition like that? It's incredibly difficult. But in Fragile X, we have a lot of potential trial subjects. And then once a drug gets marketed, we have a lot of patients out there. We have a big market. And it's not just in the United States, it's all around the world. It's all ethnicities, all racial groups, all countries. And so Fragile X is everywhere, and that's something that appeals to pharmaceutical companies. But as if that weren't appealing enough, Fragile X is also a really good model for studying autism, and it's a really good platform, if you will, for developing treatments for autism. The real bugaboo in autism research, in autism clinical trials to date, has been that basically there isn't one thing that's autism. Autism is 1,000 different things that are all kept under one big umbrella. And when it comes time for clinical trials, if you have 100 subjects in your clinical trial, they probably have 100 different things. And it's no surprise that when you do the trial and you test a particular medication or other treatment strategy, not everybody is going to respond the same way. But in Fragile X, the one thing that we can be sure of is that everybody has essentially the same problem. There may be differences in the severity and how much they're affected, mosaicism, etc. But they all have the same thing, and that's saying something. And that's very appealing to pharma companies who've been frustrated trying to develop drugs for other indications like schizophrenia, like Alzheimer's disease, and they've had a lot of trouble. It's important to note that even though we have good treatments for schizophrenia and a lot of other psychiatric disorders, most of those were simply discovered serendipitously. They weren't developed by this rational drug discovery process. The process that we have allows us to take the serendipitous discoveries and maybe improve upon them. And then we like to refer to those as the Me Too drugs. They're not really innovation, they're just improvements and evolution. Well, if you actually want to do something revolutionary and really change the landscape and develop new drugs, you need to choose conditions like Fragile X and other monogenic conditions that have a well-characterized cause, well-characterized disease mechanisms, and well-characterized animal models. And then once you've done that, you move on to clinical trials, and you can actually stratify your patients by looking at some of these biomarkers. And in the case of Fragile X, we have the ultimate biomarker in the gene itself, so you can actually test that. And when you do that, you have a much greater chance of success. Now, from our perspective, we look at some of the clinical trials that we've seen in Fragile X and we think, oh, this is so hard. We've had a whole bunch of clinical trials that haven't worked out, and a bunch of drugs that are probably never going to make it to the market that have been in clinical trials now, and it just didn't work, and it's never going to work. This is terrible. But from the pharma standpoint, it's been tremendously successful because they're used to having this level of failure. They have to do 100 different drugs in development to get one that ends up making it to the market. So it's all about having those shots on goal, as they like to say in the pharma industry. You're not going to get a goal every single time, but you got to keep going for the net. And that's what we're doing. And the pharma people are, if anything, very impressed by the level of success that we've had so far. These have not been failures. These have been learning experiences. We've learned from them, and things are getting much, much better.